the French have a bad reputation because people come to their country and they're reading travel books and they're like, bonjour, ça va bien? And they're like, what did you say? Like, what language are you speaking to me?
This is the Actual Fluency Podcast, helping you become a better language learner by providing motivating weekly inspiration, as well as top tips and tricks from expert guests. And now, your host, Chris Broholm.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 116 of the Actual Fluency Podcast. On today's show, I'm joined by Gabriel Wyner, the best-selling author of the book Fluent Forever: How to Learn Any Language Fast and Never Forget It. On today's show, we talk primarily about his recent Kickstarter success, which saw him raise over $400,000 for his new Fluent Forever language learning app, which is in development. And we catch up since the last time he was on the show. So please do enjoy this episode with Gabriel Wyner. All right, Gabe, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
Fantastically. So, as we talked about just before the recording button was hit, it's been actually almost 3 years since we did our last recording, which is quite crazy. It feels like last year.
Completely insane. It definitely feels like last year. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe it was last year, and there's just been some kind of mix-up in the TARDIS or Matrix or whatever. But before we get into the sort of recent developments, can you let all the listeners know what's been going on in your life in the last 3 years after the release of your bestseller, Fluent Forever?
I guess 3 years ago was pretty much right when the book came out. It came out in August, so this is about like a couple months. I guess we must have talked like a couple months after the book came out.
Yeah, exactly.
And God, that's nuts. So the book came out. That spawned an entire full-time business, basically. I mean, I had done a Kickstarter before we talked that last time. That was to develop pronunciation trainers. That Kickstarter, in terms of my time estimates, I had no idea what I was doing, clearly, because I just finished the last product from that Kickstarter last week.
Right.
Which is nuts. Now, to be fair to me slightly, is that like when I one of the things that's tricky about Kickstarters is that you set up this funding target and you set up this goal. And usually your first goal is not the only goal you want to accomplish. Like in my case, with that first Kickstarter in 2013, I wanted to create, I think, 10 or 11 pronunciation training apps. And I wanted to do them the very bare bottom, like the base level of what I was planning on doing was just making some small Anki decks. Like that was the whole plan. Make a few Anki decks that include some like spelling, like stuff like B as in boy sounds like what? And you're like, buh. Maybe has pictures of boys on it, like for the B as in boy card. Has, a voice actor or two, probably two voice actors, I think was the goal, where someone could say buh and another person could say boy in the target languages, whatever. And that was it. And I had done that for Hungarian, and it had taken me like 4 hours to kind of cobble something together. And I figured, okay, well, if I'm going to really do a lot of careful work on this, then it will take longer than 4 hours. And I will have more than one speaker, and so that will take more time and more money. So let's set this goal of $10,000 and do 11 languages, and that should take me 6 to 9 months.
Right.
And that was the first goal. And then that goal wasn't at all what we did. We ended up creating 65 products.
Wow.
So the workload increased sixfold, and it took us 3 years and 10 months to finish. We ended up producing 32 word lists, which were illustrated by a bunch of web comics. So we had to commission all that stuff. I rewrote all my word lists so they formed into this sort of story order thing. We got typesetters. We had them proofread like 2 or 3 times and run out for beta tests and then sent back in for fixing. We had to get linguists on board to put in IPA for everything, because there's no way to get IPA for things without just finding a linguist who knows it and then correcting their IPA, because there's no good standards on IPA. Right. So this has been an insane, like just an insane journey. Like we ended up with the Kickstarter, we ended up raising $96,000, which sounded really cool at the time. I was like, oh my God, I was planning on raising 10,000. Like this is so much money. And like the size of this project was like the idea of trying to do this project for $10,000, like looking back on it is completely insane. Completely insane. I think I was just writing this comment, like a response to a comment on my blog about like, hey, why are the word lists not free? And like each of the word lists costs us around $1,000, and we've released 32 of them.
Right.
Like this thing has been nuts. So like that's been the last 4 years has been that. It's been just working and working full time on developing all the stuff for the first Kickstarter, and then now like preparing, and the 2 months ago was preparing for this new Kickstarter that just happened. But like, yeah, it's basically been founding a small business and then realizing that my whole life is the small business and then dedicating my whole life to the small business.
That's incredible. When you wrote the book and you started making these extra products and you started the first Kickstarter, did you have that ambition in mind, or did you just say this kind of app or pronunciation trainer would be nice to have for people? It'd be useful for some people.
It was a few things. I mean, on one level, it was that I had this experience when I was writing the book where I the first draft of my book was A, terrible, but B, I didn't have a clear idea as to how to deal with pronunciation. I knew the pronunciation was super important, but I didn't know how, like, a good way to get it across to people. Like, I personally, my pronunciation training was like, go to opera school, and like that's not a convenient way to deal with pronunciation.
Right.
And like that's not a recommendation I can stick in a book. It's like, hey everyone, the key to learning a language, go to opera school. So I sent in the first draft of my book, which was like the first chapter that I sent in was this awful chapter on pronunciation. It was just like, the epiglottal fricative is made in the back of the throat using the epiglottis. Like just wonky, like technical, terrible thing. And my editor like basically said, no, like that's not going to happen. I will cancel your contract if you send this to me again. And I started doing research, trying to figure out pronunciation stuff. Like, what can I really advise people to do other than like, hey, go out on YouTube and good luck.
Right.
Pray that you find a good teacher on YouTube, basically. And then I came across this research that turned into the pronunciation trainers, which was this minimal pair testing thing using Japanese adults, trying to see how can you teach them to hear the difference between rake and lake. And I tested it. And so I like the concept there is basically you play rake or lake at random, and then you test someone who can't hear the difference, and then you show them immediate feedback. And then if you do that for like an hour, then they permanently pick up the ability to hear the difference between rake and lake, which is like super cool research. And so I was like, well, I wonder how that feels. I wonder what that's like. And I built that for Hungarian, and it took me like the 4 hours to assemble it. And then I played with it for 10 days, like 20 minutes a day. And then at the end of those 10 days, I basically did as good, if not better, than that half semester of opera training in a particular language.
Wow.
And like this was a 10-day replacement for go to opera school.
Can you give an example of that? Like, just out of curiosity, I know a bit of Hungarian, so it'd be fun to just hear an example of a minimal pair trained in Hungarian.
Sure. Things like there was kor, like those are three different ones.
Right.
In kor and kor, those are close enough. Like those are far enough apart. But like kor and kor, like this extra long o, I could not hear initially. Like I was not, my ears were not used to the idea of length distinctions in vowels. They were a little bit used to length distinctions in consonants because of like Italian, but not at the ends of words. So things like forget things like hol and hol.
Right.
Where it's like, oh, it's an extra long L, but there's no vowel afterwards. Like that's new, and that I wasn't sensitive to hearing. Things like that. Like those were ones in Hungarian that I definitely could not hear initially, and I picked up the ability to hear, and super fast. And I was like, oh, this is really effective. Like, yeah, let's do this thing. So I saw that, and my response to that was like, this is exciting, A, Like, this is exciting that this tool works so well. And then B, like, surely someone has used this already. Like, surely this exists. And as soon as I realized that, like, it didn't exist, then I felt really responsible. Like, that it was really important that this exists, because, like, the pronunciation has been so devalued in many senses by a lot of language teachers.
Yeah.
I remember going to the French program that initially sort of turned into my book, and I had come into there with a lot of French training, with a lot of French pronunciation training, specifically pronunciation. And I showed up, and I found that over the course of it was a 7-week program, and by week 2 or 3, my accent was getting worse. And it was because we had, like, I would say, like, one teacher for every 5 to 10 students, which was like a fine ratio. But you're talking about one native speaker for every 5 to 10 people who are butchering French.
Yeah.
And so you're getting one bonjour for every, like, for 10, like, bonjours right next to you. And, like, my accent was getting worse. Like, every day I was getting a little bit worse at French, and I'm like, this is not good. Like, what do I do? And I went to the administration, and I asked, like, hey, can I teach pronunciation class? Can we have, like, a workshop? Can we, like, do something about this? And so they basically came back at me saying, like, well, but that's something for advanced students. That's something that, you know, if you're an advanced student, then you can work on pronunciation. I was like, oh no.
Yeah, that's
I'm gonna
terrible,
lose my
isn't
accent here. Like, there's nothing I can do. I can't prevent this from happening. So yeah, that was kind of disturbing for me. And when I saw that there was this option of creating something new, I jumped on it. Like, I thought it was really important to build.
Right.
There was also this other aspect of, like writing a book is a weird process with a big publisher, in the sense that it's great to have the talent, meaning, like, I owe the quality of my book to my editor. Like, my editor, like, I would not have been pushed that hard if I didn't have someone willing to just say, like, I will end you if you don't shape up.
How's that for motivation?
Oh, it's quite good for motivation. Like, the having someone who is willing to threaten your whole livelihood based on the quality of your work is an amazing and very valuable and terrifying experience. And I wouldn't have had that if I didn't have this publisher.
Right.
But, you know, royalty rates are like 7%, I think, between 7 and 10%, depending upon your deal and how many copies you've sold and stuff like that.
Right.
And so they're taking around 93% of all profits of the book. And so you don't actually get that much from selling a book. You get a widespread audience is really what you're aiming for. You get a high quality book with a wide audience.
Yeah.
And that's awesome. But, like, the 97% thing, or the 93% that's taken thing, is a little, odd. And so, especially from the standpoint of looking at something that you're spending, years working on. Like, the book took me 2 years to write, and that was basically my full-time job for 2 years. And so, in that scenario, I was looking at, like, is there any way that I don't need to be, only making, 90 cents for a copy of this book? And then when I saw these pronunciation trainers and thought, okay, well, for A, this is super important that I build this. And then B, like, I imagine that people who read this book may be interested in looking at playing around with these trainers. And those things are not just 90 cents per copy.
Of course.
And there's not someone taking, 92% of the royalties on those.
Right.
So there was sort of both. There was an idea of, I bet there is a business here, but also, like, this thing seems important. So let's do both. Let's combine both of those things.
That's really cool. And I just wanted to mention a couple of things based on that. The first is the original episode we did was actually called, like, how to improve your pronunciation or something, because I took the spin because it's the first chapter of the book, and also because you came from the opera training, we had a lot of talk about the, pronunciation, why it was so important, and also the fact that you mentioned that it's so underrated, it seems. It's like, well, you can learn the language and then fix your pronunciation after, which is like completely crazy to me that people do this, but I see it everywhere. It's like, well, I just want to speak. Yeah, but it does help you a bit. So I remember that was kind of interesting that was the sort of the overarching topic of the first show was pronunciation, and it still gets ignored. And the other thing I would say is it's been 3 years since I read Fluent Forever, or thereabouts, when we had the talk. And I still remember one of your sentences, like, it was a really furious sentence of something like, I can't stand reading a textbook where there's some weird English description of the word bonjour or jour or something. And that sentence has just been forever imprinted into my memory. And it sometimes comes up, out of nowhere. And especially when I read the SML series, which I'm sure you've seen that they do that quite extensively. Of course, I'm not saying it's completely terrible, but I just think of you every time I see those approximations, I think was the polite word. So that's pretty cool.
I'm glad you've left such an imprint.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know. It doesn't help at all, does it? To see an approximation of the pronunciation. Like, what has that ever done to anyone?
It reinforces bad habits is what it does. I think it does damage.
Yeah. It's like if you taught someone a language only through writing and then had that person teach the language to someone else. That's the quality you would get, I think.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I mean, people like the French have a bad reputation because of like books like that. In my opinion, like I think the French have a bad reputation because people come to their country and they're reading travel books and they're like, bonjour, ça va bien? And they're like, what did you say? Like, what language are you speaking to me? And it's frustrating and like people have had this experience where people will come up to them and try to speak their language, but speak it with a thick accent. And if it's hard to understand, then you as a listener, like you listening to your native language misspoken in some way, if it's hard to understand, you will start feeling angry.
Yeah.
And just like frustrated. You're like, just to say something different, like fix it. Because it doesn't feel good to think slowly. It doesn't feel good. Like when your cell phone reception is bad, you also feel like frustrated and angry because you can't quite hear what they're saying. And like that doesn't feel good. And I think the French get like this really bad rap with it because like the French spelling is so brutal and the sounds are so distant from English that people will come over and like completely butcher the language and be completely not understandable in any way. And then these French speakers are just like, what are you saying? And are getting really angry. And then they get this rap of like being really angry people.
Yeah, I think you're onto something there for sure. And also, just the last throwback to the last episode was we were talking about the rolled R, because that's, if you ask people what's your problem with pronunciation, most people will say the rolled R, unless you're, of course, from one of the countries where it's used. And a little update, a project update, 3 years in the making. I still walk down the street saying Pedin zu Pedosche, if you remember. And
I do remember that.
It's getting close. I will say I'm not working very hard on it, to be fair, because I'm not really... Well, the Russian, I do work on a little bit, which sometimes has they do use the rolled R, but it's not as... it doesn't seem as pressing as Spanish, which I was briefly touching a bit on this year. But it's getting very close. But I'm not sure if I'm faking it sometimes, where instead of like rolling the tongue, it's more of like a throatal roll in a way, if that makes any sense. I don't know if any...
You might be rolling the back, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So sometimes I actually asked some Spanish speakers, could you judge my pronunciation of this word? I think I said like perro or something. And they were like, wow, you rolled the R really well. And I could just feel that it was wrong. I don't know what I was doing, but it felt wrong. So that's in case people listen to the previous episode before this, that's kind of what's been going on. But I do feel an improvement, and I've been talking to other people about it, and they say, it just takes practice, like we also talked about last time.
Yeah. No, some of these things take a while. I mean, you're trying to get your muscles to behave, which like, they aren't just going to react in a day. So yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know if people think I'm weird for walking down the street and going like Raul, but sometimes it helps.
That kind of stuff is exactly what people need.
Right, a bit of crazy in there every day. So let's go up to present day. So right now, the Kickstarter, the second one you're running, it's going beyond what I guess anyone could have imagined. I mean, at this time it says I think it was like $430,000 at the time of recording. Take us through it. What happened?
You're saying bigger than anyone has imagined. I'm like sort of staring at this thing being like, you need to get to 850,000. You need to get there.
Right. But it's the most funded app of all time.
It totally is. And that was, yes. So it's been exciting. It's been nuts. I guess, let me know where you want to start.
Yeah. Well, basically, like, when did you decide to take the pronunciation trainers and kind of evolve that idea? Because in the video to the Kickstarter, you said you had the idea of the current app, or the Kickstarter that's going on now. You said you had the idea for that, or at least some of the idea for that already in 2012. So yeah. I just wanted to know how you evolved it from the pronunciation trainers. Like, what were lacking back then in the method? Because for those people who haven't read the book, obviously it's quite of a, I wouldn't call it a hardcore method, but it's definitely a method that takes some work. Like you put a lot of effort into creating some content that you can then learn off of, and you also learn from the process itself. But you had the pronunciation, you had, first of all, the book, of course, went into the pronunciation trainers. And I guess the first part is, what's the new thing? Like, can you give a quick 30-second explanation of the new app, like the vision you have?
Sure. Actually, maybe in answering the history question, that sort of answers what this thing is. The source of this thing, like when it started, was I used to teach workshops. I sort of stopped doing them after I made a big one online for creative. But I used to do workshops where I would teach my method before the book came out. This was in 2012. I did a lot of them, and they were 12 hours long, and around 6 to 8 hours of those workshops were like learning how to use Anki really well. Mm-hmm. And like, I think many of your listeners will be familiar with Anki. It's ANKI. Some of them won't, but Anki is basically like really sophisticated flashcard software that is flexible. It is able to do anything. Like I learned how to write using Anki. I learned English style using Anki. I memorized like composers' birth dates and death dates using Anki. Like Anki can do almost anything. And when you make a platform that can do almost anything, it's going to be challenging to use.
Right.
And so like I personally don't have any problems with Anki in terms of as a platform. I think it must exist. Like it's really important that Anki exists. Like I think it's a important thing for the world that there is a platform that can do things that are that broad, that can really do almost anything. That said, like I remember teaching this workshop, and like there were people who were like 50-year-old, like people like my mom. There was like my mom basically in the workshop. Like she never took one of the workshops, but like someone like one of my workshops, someone like my mom. And like my mom is not computer savvy, and I was trying to teach these people like how to drag an audio file into Anki on like a small screen. And the process of dragging an audio file into Anki, if you have no idea how to use a computer, like it's about, here's how to right click. Like I'm going to teach you how to right click. And now I'm going to log you into forvo.com. So now you get to like download pronunciations of your words, like recordings of your words. So first, let's teach you how to log into a website. Okay. Now let's teach you how to right click on this thing that says download. That's a file link that you don't necessarily know is a link to a file, but it is. And so you're going to right click on that thing. Now you're going to select download file. Now you're going to download it to desktop. Okay. Now let's go to your desktop. You're going to click on that file and then move your mouse. And then like they'll click once and then they'll move their mouse. I'm like, okay, no, don't just click once. Okay, click and hold. Don't let go. And now move your mouse. Okay, now you've picked up the file. It's in your cursor. Now don't let go of your right hand, but with your left hand, hit Alt and then Tab and move into Anki. And like, this is a 4-finger, 2-handed maneuver that I'm trying to teach someone who doesn't know how to use a computer.
Right.
And like that should not be necessary for language learning. Like the idea of forcing someone to learn how to use a two-handed mouse plus keyboard maneuver that involves a motion with the mouse, a click with the mouse that you're holding, and holding down the Alt key and hitting Tab, but only hitting Tab just once. You can't hold them both down, or else you'll switch applications a whole bunch of times. Like I'm watching myself teach this, and I'm like, this is ridiculous.
Yeah.
Like, I should not be spending my life teaching this. These students should not be like having to learn how to do this. Like this should not be in their way to learn a language. Like this is insane. And yet, like at that point, it was really clear. Like I knew of no faster method for learning languages. Like for me, Anki was essential. And so I did teach it. Like I spent the 6 to 8 hours it took to get someone to the point where they could handle, this click, drag, alt, tab thing to move an audio file into a box. And don't worry, if you miss the box by 2 pixels, then you have to start all over again. Like all of this stuff, like this was silly. And from that point on, it was like, it is clear this must be fixed. All of this is unnecessary. All of this, the only impediment, like many people would take this workshop. Like the workshop was actually pretty good in the sense that people left that being like, okay, I feel comfortable with this. This does seem silly that I have to do this much work, but I get the idea and I'm going to try it. And so the technological boundary was like a barrier. We could sort of overcome that over the course of this workshop. But like if someone were just to read the book and then watch like a 1-hour tutorial on my website, like there were definitely a ton of people who saw this tutorial or whatever and were just like, this is too hard. I'm not going to do this. Interesting ideas, but I'm not going to do this.
Right.
And so I was definitely losing people. And I was losing people for no good reason. Like the only reason that I was losing people is because no one had done the work to make something that was easier for them. It was solid. Like the concepts are solid. Like the only thing in the way is that right now the route there is by learning how to use like a click, drag, alt, tab thing into a box. And so the app has always been this idea of, what if I looked at everything that was hard about this method, everything that required skill at maneuvering through a computer, everything that was a waste of time that wasn't actually giving you learning, like this creation process of like, how do you take a sentence and turn it into a study tool that you can use later? Like that process is essential for me. That process of looking at information and deciding how you want to store it in your head. And then as a result of that process, getting a thing like a flashcard that you get to use later on to keep it in your head. Like that process is key. I don't want to take that away from anyone. But there were a lot of inefficiencies inside of that process. There was no reason you had to type out the word more than once.
Right.
Or even that you even had to type out the word. Like if we had a list of words that you could learn, like suggested words, you shouldn't have to type it all. You should never have to select the word and copy it somewhere. Like you shouldn't have to I created all these scripts on my website over the last few years for searching 5 to 10 websites at once. Like you can search Google Images and like 3 different dictionaries and Forvo.com for recordings and stuff. Like that's cool that you can type the word once and have it search 5 to 10 websites. That is time savings, but like, why should you have to copy and paste that word at all?
Right.
Like that's a time waste. Like I shouldn't need to look on websites. Like there should be a way for an app to look on websites for me. And then for me to only spend my time making decisions, because it's the decisions that are the learning experience. The decision of, here's, I'm going to look up the word for dog in French, chien, and I'm going to find that like French dogs look different than American dogs. And I can just look at that and decide on a picture that sort of captures that memory for me. That decision process, this process of looking at pictures and deciding things, like that's where the learning happens. And shouldn't there be a way for me to spend all of my time doing that? Like just the learning thing, and spend basically none of my time click, drag, alt, tabbing or copying and pasting. And so the app was always sort of intended to do that. It was looking at the whole workflow of how is it that I learn languages and seeing, can I make this thing completely efficient? Can I make that every single second that someone is spending in this app, can I make that be a learning experience? And so that was sort of the goal with this app, and that's what we're accomplishing here is that. And so like the user experience with the app is basically it's the pronunciation trainers minus the 45-minute installation video.
Right.
They just work. You don't need to install Anki. You don't need to like put this pronunciation trainer into Anki. It's just here's some videos, watch them, press a button saying that you watched them, and then you can study. You're done. That's it. And then it's here's a list of words to learn. Tap on a word if you want to learn it. Here are a bunch of sentences you can learn them in. As soon as you choose a sentence, then it's like, what picture do you want for your word? And then if you choose a picture, it says, do you want to learn any other words in this sentence? If so, tap on those words. And then you just keep repeating this process until you've taken in all the data from that sentence. And then you can move to the next sentence or the next word or do anything else you want. And so every interaction that you have with this app is with your target language and making choices about it. What words do you want to learn? What pictures do you want to use? What sentences do you want to use? So like that was sort of the goal with this thing, and that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, that's incredibly cool because I'm just trying to think about current solutions, and there are obviously many flashcard apps. In fact, I have a big problem with flashcard apps in general because having even a medium-sized website in the language learning industry, you get quite a lot of can you try my app, please? And it's all flashcards in some way or another. And I always say, like, what is your sort of unique selling point based on instead of just using Anki, which is like it's been the golden standard for so many years, but it also has been very clunky and you know, I never really liked using it because for me, it was just too much work, and they didn't have the syncing for a long time. Like you had to set up some weird, you had to get another app, like a third party. Yeah, it was, lots of problems there. So it's exciting that you're trying to, or are solving this problem of the technical side, because that shouldn't take a lot of time at all. Like that shouldn't be important, but I guess there's still, you don't take away from the actual creative effort of creating your learning materials, because you're still picking the words and the sentences that you'd like. Because I remember in the book you talked about how creating your own flashcards is a learning activity in and of itself. It's not just the studying of the flashcards, it's also being part of making them. And I guess you can serve that with the new app as well when you pick them out.
That's the main intent of the app. I mean, it's one of the reasons that a lot of language learning apps tend to fail, is that either they're hard to use. Either they don't give you anything in the sense of something like Anki, where it's like, this is just a platform, use it however you like. And there's no structure to it. It's just do whatever you want. And so you don't know where to go and what to do. And that's been, my book and my website and stuff have all been about, if you have this big open place like Anki, like this land of Anki, then here's a structure for you. Or you have things where they just give you content.
Yeah.
And like, I think we've all kind of had this experience in school where we had a test coming up, and either we made study guides for ourselves, or we borrowed someone else's. And for most people, the experience of making your own study guide, like often you never even needed to look at that study guide.
Right.
Like you learned the material while making it. And then the experience of using someone else's study guides is generally not very successful. Like generally, if you grab someone else's flashcards or someone else's study guide for a test and then you look at it, like you won't do well on that test. And that's because like flashcards are an amazing tool. There's a reason why most of the apps that are on the market have something to do with flashcards, is because testing is, as far as I recall, 5 times more effective than reading. Like if you just present information to someone as opposed to you testing them on that information, they retain things 5 times more if you're testing.
Yeah.
But if you're testing stuff that someone never learned, then like that's not a good route to learning that material.
Right. Yeah.
Like flashcards are super for remembering stuff that you've already learned, not to learn it in the first place.
Right.
And so for me, the learning experience is in looking at material and making decisions about it. And so that's been the whole goal of this app, is how do we preserve all the good stuff about flashcard creation and get rid of the bad stuff, which is like, oh, isn't that a lot of work? Like, it's just, can we get rid of the work part and leave all the good stuff, the decision part? Because making decisions is is fun potentially. Like it's and not just potentially, it's fun. Like you looking at a bunch of like Spanish language memes about dogs and being like, that's ridiculous, I'm gonna use that picture. Like, that's fun.
Yeah.
I haven't met people who don't really enjoy that process of getting surprised. Like we like being surprised by what we see. But you having to do this sort of busy work of like, okay, well, now I have to type this word in 5 times, or now I have to select this word and like delete it and put in underscore so it's a fill in the blank sentence. Like that's not fun. That's just repetitive motions over and over and over again.
Right. Yeah, it's for sure. I mean, I keep thinking about like the existing platforms, how it's really hard to make a test or learn from a test because let's say you have the languages you're learning from English to something, which is also one of the advantages of your method, is that you don't have a from language in a sense. You have like a visualization, a picture of the thing, or I guess a representation of, if it's a more abstract concept. That kind of gets rid of that problem where you see a sentence and you have no idea how to say it in the new language because you don't know if it's an idiomatic phrase or like, if you do a close test, for instance, you just take one word in a sentence, like you don't know what that word's going to be unless you've seen the test before. And then you're actually being tested on the test rather than the knowledge of that word and how it works in combination. So yeah, it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, it's honestly like looking at what everything else is like. There's so many tools out there, and like looking at those tools, like it's not like everyone's screwing it up. It's that it's hard. Like it's hard to make a good language learning tool because this is like you're talking about how do you change how someone thinks in a permanent manner.
Yeah,
and like that's not an easy task. And also, how do you do that in a way that makes them enjoy it?
Yeah.
So that they keep using it from day to day. Like those parameters are not easy. So like there's not a lot of routes through that are going to produce something that's satisfying and also works. And so I'm not surprised looking around being like, well, hey, well, this one doesn't work and that one doesn't work. Well, like, yeah, but like it's hard. Like, of course it doesn't work necessarily because like it's hard to make something that is enjoyable to use. If you find something that really like works, then you may well find that it's not something that people want to use.
Right. Actually, that's funny. I wrote about that and I didn't know what to call it, so I just called it my own name. But basically, my theory was there are methods that are really efficient but super boring, so people just get turned off of it. So that could be Anki. And then there are methods that are super fun, like watching a movie in Spanish or whatever, but you don't really learn that much from just watching the movie without thinking about it, like subtitles or scripts or like putting any active thought into it. I mean, I'm sure it helps. Sure. No, not dissing the watching movies and shows. I think if you can't do anything else, definitely do that. But there was this like some kind of gradient or like I call it some mathematical term that I forgot. But so I definitely agree with that there needs to be a balance, because the hardest thing about learning a language is actually doing the work. And there are different ways of enjoying the process, and we're all different, of course, but it has to be enjoyable. I mean, is that the most important thing? What do you think?
I do think that's absolutely necessary and maybe the most important thing. You don't actually learn things when you're bored. Right. Your brain has a good defense against boredom, which is just like, oh, I'm not paying attention to this because I'm bored. Like if you aren't having fun, like then it doesn't matter what you're doing.
Yeah. Definitely. So in the video, you talk about how the app is basically a companion from complete beginner to fluency. And I don't want to talk necessarily about the debate about fluency because as we've talked about it lots of times here on the show, but I do want to talk about the developing that entire process or tools required. Is there a point where you take let's say a collection of sentences, or let's say 625 words, or however many words you need to get into a good point in the language, and actually convert that into an actively used language? Because I can imagine there's a difference between me being able to be tested on a sentence full of words in Russian, but actually going up and using that sentence to someone, what are your plans for, if you have any at this point, of kind of not putting into the real world, because it is in the real world, of course, but like, how do you actually take that knowledge you gained from the app and then apply it, is what I'm thinking.
Super question. Yeah. For the last 2 years, my main source of Spanish and Japanese has been tutors on italki. And it's been using tutors in italki in a very, very targeted manner. What I've been doing basically is, for Japanese, for instance, I started from, both of them actually, I started from scratch. I had 0 words. I hired a tutor for, italki's giant price of like $5 an hour.
Yeah. It's great
because italki's amazing, and yeah, and so I have this tutor, and I send them a copy of my 625 word list, and I say, all right, well, I don't know any Japanese, so let's get started. The first word in this list is, the first 6 words are like, one white dot, up, sky, star. Because we put these things in little clumps of like stories. So like up in the sky, there's a white dot in the sky, and it's a star. It's sort of like this little haiku of a bunch of words that I want to learn. And so I'm like, these are the words I want to learn today. Let's spend the next hour learning these, 6 to 8 words. And by that I mean I want to make a sentence with the word dot, and I want it to have something to do with my life. Like a thing that I would actually talk about. And I'm like, well, there's like a black dot in the middle of my laptop screen. So let's say that. And like, they'll explain how to say this sentence. So there's a black dot in the middle of my laptop screen. And I'll ask about it. I'll be like, okay, so where's the word dot? Like, let's talk about this word dot. And then like, how does it work in this sentence? Like, let's talk about this thing until I really understand how this sentence works. And then I'll have them record it. I'll have them record that one sentence, and that will be my content. And then we'll move to the next word, and we'll be like, okay, star. So like, when I was in Pennsylvania, I could look up and I could see 1 million stars in the sky. And so, well, sentence 2 in Japanese, and I'll go through again, and I'll be like, okay, where's Pennsylvania? Okay, how do I say, where's the stars? How do I number stars? How do I count stars in Japanese? Like, how does that work? And we'll have this big discussion, and like maybe now 30 minutes have elapsed. Because like, these are the first 2 sentences I've ever seen in Japanese, and I have a lot of questions to ask, and that's fine. Like, I've been learning a lot, and so we progress, and then eventually we get through all 6 words, and it's been an hour. It's taken an hour to learn 6 words, and that's fine. And I get recordings of these 6 sentences, and then when I'm done with this Skype call, I go to Anki and I basically dump these sentences in, and every sentence for me is 20 flashcards, because I can learn Pennsylvania, and I can learn when, and I can learn this idea of past tense in Japanese, and I can learn word order, and I can learn star, and I can learn how to count stars, and I can learn the word for million, and like, and then if I'm learning kanji, then I have 100 flashcards, and so I have all of this stuff coming out of these 6 sentences. Basically, I get a week's worth of work to memorize all the content in these sentences, and memorize it in a really like effective way, not just memorize like, I know the translation for the word star, but like, no, I know how Japanese thinks about stars. I know how they fit into sentences. I know where they land in terms of the word order. I know where they land in terms of how the numbers relate to them, like all this stuff. And so the result is that I've now internalized that hour-long conversation. That's now in my head in like a really effective manner. Like that's now Japanese. That's not some information about Japanese. That's actual Japanese. And next week I do the same thing, except now I can make faster progress. I go through maybe 8 to 10 words, and I start picking up Japanese phrases, and I start asking things like, how do I say, can you repeat that again in Japanese? And so we'll learn that, and that'll be a recorded sentence too. And after about, I would say 2 months of this, our conversations are mostly in Japanese.
Wow.
It's a gradual shift, but because I'm internalizing like literally every word that happens that I think is useful, that becomes internalized for me. By the end of those like 2 or 3 months, most of our conversations can stay in Japanese. Like we'll need a word from time to time in English, but like most of that conversation is in Japanese. And so it took me like maybe 6 to 9 months to get through the 625 word list for Japanese. But by the end of that word list, it wasn't like I only knew 625 words. Like that first sentence with, when I was in Pennsylvania, I could look up in the sky and see, a million stars. That's not just the word star.
Right.
Like it's a lot.
Of course. How many flashcards?
A lot. Just like 20, average of 10 to 20 flashcards per sentence. Initially. Like it goes down. Like as 3 months in, I might only get like 4 to 6 flashcards per sentence.
Sure.
But initially, like everything, I'm taking everything. And so 9 months in, I'm holding conversations about and I'm dancing. Instead of jumping to English when I don't know a word, I try to explain the word that I'm looking for in Japanese. And so at this point, I'm able to speak like conversational Japanese at like a B1 level. And I also have 1,000 sentences by this point.
Right.
Now all internalized and are in my flashcard deck. Now, I really like this method. I think it's spectacularly effective. Those 1,000 sentences, they're only valuable to me. And that's dumb. And that's one of the goals of this app is if I'm going to be doing this sort of activity of me going to a tutor every week and playing around with the language, all of my sentences should be available to everyone else studying Japanese. And so that's part of this app is that if I'm interacting with a tutor, that content is for everybody. Like, yes, there'll be privacy settings, and if I want a sentence just for me, then so be it. But like generally, those sentences are available for everybody. The other sort of goal with this app is make that interaction with a tutor really easy. Right now, I have to talk to my tutor. I have to record the Skype call. Like I made a little web app that allows, like if they're using the Chrome browser, like they can record a sentence in the app. And that's kind of the direction we're going to go with the new one. But like practically speaking, it should be really straightforward to talk to a tutor, have them say a sentence, have them write it down, and for that to be in my flashcards. And so part of this sort of speaking idea, this idea of how do I turn this into active conversation, is me pushing users, like giving people resources. So like giving them sentences with the 625 word list already pre-made with like information about grammar, giving them access to this community database so they can access all of my Japanese sentences and everyone else's, but also make it really easy to make that step, take that step from I'm sitting alone with my phone to I'm working with a tutor sentences, and then I'm putting those sentences in my head. And so that's sort of the super long way of answering your question of like, how do you move from this passive thing to active, is that I think that interaction with the tutor is the most effective use of active communication time. And I want to get people doing that as much as I possibly can.
Yeah. Now that's again, I'm just head is just spinning from this. Just think of the applications, because that's like I always saw language learning as a sort of jigsaw puzzle where you add pieces all the time. But with this perspective, it makes even more sense, because what you're basically doing is you're taking sentences. Well, I guess the first sentence you start with, it might not be super important personally to you. I don't know if there's any personal importance to the star from Pennsylvania, but like if you take any seed sentence, then everything that comes after that is basically things you want to say right there and then. And you ask the tutor, how do I say this? And then the tutor explains everything in you just break it down completely, which allows you to see the language in a conceptual sense. It's almost like the Matrix. You dive into the language compared to the alternative, which is basically like, here's a sentence in Russian, here's the English translation, learn it. And you don't understand. Yeah, exactly. You don't. And I also wrote about this, like how, but you sometimes you gotta, go through hell to figure out, what the good things are. But I started doing that on Memrise ages ago. And by the way, I do like Memrise. I think it's a good flashcard app, but of course limited to what flashcards are really. But I would do single words, just like 1,000 Russian words. And after 3 months, I couldn't say a single sentence, because that's not how the language works, or any language for that matter. For me, it's really interesting to hear you talking about this method, the Fluent Forever method, because to me, I don't understand why we even had other methods. at this point.
I appreciate that. One thing actually that really excites me about this whole thing is the this idea of being able to get tutored like this kind of tutored content directly into your flashcards and also shared to a community, is that with minority languages, you get 2 users who are really enthusiastic about this method, like 2 or 3 users, and each of them make 1,000 sentences with their tutors, which is a typical, like a normal amount to make over the course of 6 to 9 months, if you were trying to reach fluent or reach intermediate level. Really, I won't even use the word fluency. It's such a loaded, terrible word.
Yeah.
But like reaching an intermediate level in this thing, suddenly, like usually now you have 2 more people who can hold a conversation in this language. But suddenly, if you allow all of their content to become public and accessible to everybody, then you just created in that minority language in something like Mohawk or things like that, where I was teaching workshops up there in Canada, and like they're struggling for resources. No one's written a textbook on these languages necessarily, or those textbooks are hard to read and are super dense and are written by linguists. But suddenly you make it possible to just access 2,000 sentences from 2 students, and you get to now learn Mohawk. And then you have a 3rd student who maybe does more things. Now you have maybe 3,000 flashcards in this language. Like there's so much promise there. Like that's the thing that excites me about this project most, is the idea of taking 2 or 3 students and suddenly creating the largest resource in a particular language that's ever existed. Like that's the potential here. And so that's kind of the thing that I'm pushing towards as hard as I possibly can.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's really cool. Also, I'm not personally I don't have a huge interest in minority languages, but I know that a lot of people listening have the passion for that. A final thing before we call this episode was just how do if you're sharing this content on a platform, I can see the benefit of it's basically, I guess, crowdsourcing in a way. You're crowdsourcing the sentences to a degree, but how do you then make them your personal sentences? Won't that limit my learning if I'm using, let's say, your Japanese sentences to learn with?
They won't be as personal. Like they can't be as personal. But because you do get to choose your words, meaning you get to choose which parts of those sentences you find most interesting, and because you also get to choose your pictures in terms of how you want to sort of symbolize this part of the story to yourself, that process does personalize sort of any content on some level. I have played with both. I've learned Japanese in part from these tutors, and in part being like, I haven't, my tutor was away this week and I couldn't work with them, and I still want to learn more. Let me grab a sentence from online. And grabbing a sentence from online, it still does work. It's not as good as a personalized one, but it works quite well because you're engaging with it, because you're choosing your words and you're choosing your pictures. And so there is always an aspect of personalization there. And even with someone else's content, that you still get to add that in because of those choices you're making. So I think that there is a loss of effectiveness, but not a total loss of effectiveness. I think you can do a lot with access to someone else's sentences, especially when you're actively going out there and looking for them. When you say, I want to learn the word, dog, let me find 5 sentences with dog and choose the one I like the most. That active search is a sort of personalization thing. You're choosing what your preference is another kind of personalization thing. So I think that's never gone.
Right.
And so to that end, I think there is, you do retain the personalization. This thing so effective.
Right. And if I can give you a suggestion, something cool would be if you have a sentence is loaded in that you're working on in the active library or whatever the name will be for it. If you could mark a certain part of a sentence and say, there's something here I don't quite understand, put a little note in, and then the app would automatically create a report that you could bring to your next tutoring session. That would be pretty cool to have, because I think that often when you learn on your own, which I think a lot of people prefer to do, you often end up thinking like, I don't even like, why is it this word and why is it this ending and why is it that honorific or whatever, But if you could put a note in it, then you could get it sorted out later while still maintaining efficiency, because I assume you can learn a lot more on your own, really, because you're not tied down to a teacher schedule or like a quiet place sometimes also. So that could be cool. But anyway, time has flown, and it's now in the middle of the night here, and I don't know what time it is over there, but I suspect it's getting later as well. So
it is.
I just want to thank you so much for coming on and sharing the app. And just to be clear to people, there's still time. There's still time to join the Kickstarter. There's a couple of days left. I don't know entirely when this is going out, but let's just say I'll get it out before the Kickstarter ends for sure.
Awesome.
And people can search for Fluent Forever on Kickstarter.com. And it will be there. If it's not on the front page, no, it probably will be. And what kind of rewards can people get if they decide to back your idea?
We have a lot of stuff. Basically, joining the Kickstarter gives you a lifetime discount on the access to the app. We found early on we had to do some sort of subscription model. I was aiming not to, but we have to because it costs money to use Google Images, and Google image search is such a key part of this app that I wasn't comfortable with any way that would get rid of that. And so we basically everyone as part of the Kickstarter has a super cheap subscription model. Everyone after the Kickstarter, it starts getting more expensive. Or we have sort of lifetime subscriptions where for people who really don't like the idea of subscriptions, we have just lifetime access to single languages or lifetime access to every language we ever do for people who are just like, I want to learn 10 languages. Like, okay, for you, there is a thing. But yeah, so basically there's different access to the app for different amounts of time all the way up to lifetime.
That's cool. And the languages, how did you pick the languages? Was it just your personal interest, or do you have some kind of like a scientific approach to what languages you're rolling out first?
That's basically based on popularity. If it was just on my own approach, I would only make an app for Japanese. But yeah, no, we're aiming, like I'm aiming to hit the stretch goal that means that we get to cover all language, period. This idea of if two students want to learn Mohawk, then so be it, and they can, and everyone can share their resources. That's going to be once we hit 850,000. That may happen during this Kickstarter, and it may happen shortly thereafter. We're going to launch an Indiegogo campaign right after, like the same day. The prices will go up because we want to, give the Kickstarter people their bonus for really coming in super early.
Early bird.
But yeah, the early bird thing. But there will still be an Indiegogo campaign, mostly so we can keep how much funds we're raising, so that we can see how far we get in terms of stretch goal. Because I do want to keep adding languages features to this thing all the way up to hit average.
Fantastic. Well, have a great day and best of luck with the rest of the campaign. And if anyone is interested about Gabe and his projects, then fluent-forever.com is the place to go to. And other than that, just happy learning. And I hope we don't wait 3 years until the next call.
Me too.
All right. See ya.
All right. Thanks so much.